Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into how a really chaotic decade, rising taxes, escalating protests, all set the stage for the American Revolution. It's really a story about how a string of bad moves by the British Empire ended up creating a whole new American identity.
Okay, let's just start with one number, a really staggering number, 13.5. After winning this massive, globe-spanning war in 1763, Britain's national debt was, get this, 13.5 times its entire annual income. That single number, it pretty much explains everything that's about to happen.
So, this victory in what we call the 7 Years' War, it gave Britain this huge, sprawling empire, bigger than ever before, that included a ton of new land in North America. But holding on to all that territory? Super expensive. And London looked across the ocean and thought, hey, the American colonies? They need to start paying their fair share, and we need to tighten the leash a bit.
And man, they did not waste any time. A whole bunch of new rules came down, one right after another. Bang, a law that says you can't settle west. Bang, another one cracking down on smugglers, using courts without juries, by the way. And bang, a third one that messes with their paper money, which was a huge deal for an economy that was already struggling. So if you're a colonist, you're starting to see a pattern here, right? And it doesn't look good.
And then came March 1765. Parliament does something they have never done before. This one act, well, it was the match that lit the fuse for the revolution. They passed something called the Stamp Act.
Now, you gotta understand, this was different. This wasn't some tax on goods coming in from overseas. No, this was a direct tax, an internal tax. It meant you had to buy a special stamp for pretty much any piece of paper you used. Newspapers, legal documents, diplomas, even playing cards. It hit everybody, from printers and lawyers to recent grads and sailors. And that's the key. That's why the backlash was so massive and came from all corners.
So the whole argument from the colonist side really boiled down to this one crucial difference. They were mostly okay with what they called external taxes, duties on imports and exports to manage trade across the empire. Fine. But an internal tax? A tax just to raise money directly from them? Whoa, no. They saw that as a completely different animal.
And you had guys like Daniel Dulany from Maryland spelling it out. They said, look, the right to tax us just to make money, that belongs to our assemblies, the people we actually vote for. It was a bedrock principle of English rights. No taxation without representation, without consent.
So what was Britain's comeback? They had this idea called virtual representation. The argument was, hey, every member of parliament represents the whole empire, not just the little district that elected them, so you guys are represented. The colonists thought this was, well, let's just say they didn't buy it. One writer literally called it a monstrous idea.
Okay, so the lines are drawn, and the resistance to the Stamp Act just explodes all across the colonies. But it wasn't just one big mob. The protest actually took 3 very different forms, and it kind of broke down along class lines.
You had resistance coming from everywhere. The elites were fighting it in their government assemblies. The merchants were fighting it with their wallets. And regular, everyday colonists, they took the fight to the streets. Each group had a really important part to play.
So, first up you have the political elites. They used the system. Their assemblies passed these powerful resolutions. You've probably heard of the Virginia Resolves, basically saying we have the same rights as anyone in Britain. They even got together for a Stamp Act Congress and put out this unified document, a Declaration of Rights and Grievances.
All right, second, the merchants. They went for the wallet. They organized boycotts, agreeing to stop importing British goods. The plan was brilliant, really. Squeeze the British merchants so hard that they would go to Parliament and beg for a repeal. And you know what? It was a super effective strategy.
And then there was the third form of protest, popular protest. This is where things got real. We're talking groups like the Sons of Liberty, using intimidation, threats, and sometimes straight-up violence. I mean, look at this notice from New York. That's a threat, plain and simple. They were burning effigies, trashing buildings. They made it physically impossible for the Stamp Act to be enforced.
And guess what? All that pressure? It worked. In 1766, Parliament caves and repeals the Stamp Act. The colonies go nuts, huge celebrations. But here's the catch, the fine print they might have missed in all the excitement. On the very same day, Parliament passed something called the Declaratory Act. It basically said, oh, by the way, we still have the power to tax you whenever and however we want. So yeah, this fight was not over, not by a long shot.
Because, let's face it, Britain still needed that money. So a year later, in 1767, they try again. this time with the Townshend. These were new taxes on everyday stuff like lead, glass, paint, and tea. Now, Britain tried to say, hey, these are external taxes, they're totally fine. But the colonists weren't having it. They saw it for what it was, another attempt to tax them for revenue, just dressed up differently.
But this time, the resistance felt different. It was bigger, more organized. The boycotts came back, but now women were playing this huge public role. They formed spinning clubs to make their own cloth, turning homespun fabric into a symbol of American patriotism. And this is so important. The colonies set up committees of correspondence. This was basically a network to share news and coordinate their plans. They were starting to act like a single unit.
Well, to enforce these really unpopular laws, what does Britain do? They send troops. They land in Boston in 1768, and overnight, the city basically becomes an occupied town. You can just feel the tension. It was a total powder keg, just waiting for something to set it off.
And that spark finally came on a chilly night in March 1770. A crowd started gathering around a British soldier, taunting him, throwing snowballs. More soldiers show up, things get more and more tense, and then, in all that chaos and anger, someone fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 civilians from Boston were dead, lying in the snow. One of them was a man named Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American heritage. He's often remembered as the first martyr of the Revolution.
And what happened next really shows you how powerful those new colonial networks were. An engraving made by Paul Revere started circulating. It showed these bloodthirsty British soldiers with evil grins just firing into a peaceful, innocent crowd. Now, was it accurate? Not at all. It was pure propaganda. But it was effective. It spread like wildfire and got everyone in every colony feeling sorry for Boston and furious with Britain.
After what everyone was calling the Boston Massacre, Britain backed down again. They repealed most of the Townshend taxes. But in those 5 years, from 65 to 70, something really deep had changed. The whole nature of how the colonists resisted had transformed.
And here's the key takeaway. Think about it. Back during the Stamp Act, the protests were kind of separate, right? You had the politicians doing their thing over here and the mobs doing their thing over there. But by 1770, it was a coordinated, inclusive movement. You had colonists from all walks of life, men and women, working together. They were building something that just didn't exist a few years earlier.
All these years of Britain's failed policies and the colonists pushing back, it did more than just make them angry. It accidentally made them united. Through this constant cycle of fighting back, they started to see themselves as something more than just Virginians or Pennsylvanians. They started to feel like they were part of a single American community.
Which brings us to one last question to chew on for this explainer. Now that the colonies were connected, now that they had a common cause and a way to act together, was there any turning back? Was a peaceful outcome even possible at this point? Or was the road to revolution already paved?